It was an ordinary Tuesday morning at Kensington Palace, the kind of morning that smelled like fresh-cut grass and polished leather shoes, the kind where the sky was the particular shade of grey that England does better than anywhere else on earth. The household staff moved through their routines with the quiet, practiced efficiency of people who understood that their job was to be invisible. Curtains were drawn back. Breakfast trays were carried. Doors were opened at the precise moment they needed to be opened, and closed just as precisely behind them. Nobody expected anything to go wrong. Prince George was 11 years old that morning, though he carried himself with the particular seriousness of a boy who understood, at some cellular level, that the world was always watching him. He was not a sullen child. He laughed easily, argued about football with genuine passion, and had a weakness for chocolate biscuits that his security detail had learned to exploit during tense transitions between buildings. But there was something behind his eyes, even at 11, that was older than 11. A kind of awareness. A boy who had grown up knowing that the faces in crowds were always turned toward him, always studying him, always wanting something from him that he couldn't quite name. That morning he was preparing for school. His bag sat on the polished floor of his room, open and half-packed, stuffed with the particular chaos that defines a schoolboy's life regardless of postcode or title. A maths textbook with a cracked spine. A water bottle that had leaked at some point and dried into a faint ring on the canvas. An old eraser shaped like a tiny red London bus that he refused to actually use because he'd had it since he was 6. Standard. Unremarkable. The bag of any boy going to any school on any Tuesday. His protection officer that morning was a man named David Carlyle, 14 years in the Metropolitan Police, the last 6 of them embedded in royal protection. He had a face like a closed fist, not unkind, just contained. He had worked protection long enough to develop the particular psychology of the job, the ability to be present without being intrusive, to watch without making the watched feel watched. He had stood outside hospital rooms and school gates and church pews. He had stood in the rain for 11 hours once without complaining. He had, as he sometimes reflected in quieter moments, become a kind of human furniture. Necessary. Unnoticed. It was a routine bag check. That was all it was supposed to be. Every morning, every bag, every item. The protocol was not insulting. It was not paranoid. It was simply what it was, the invisible machinery of keeping a child safe when that child happened to be third in line to the British throne. Carlyle had done this check dozens of times. He knew the contents of that bag the way a librarian knows their shelves. The maths textbook. The water bottle. The little red bus eraser that he'd once made the mistake of asking about, only to receive a 10-minute explanation of its history and significance from a then 8-year-old Prince George. He unzipped the front pocket first. The note was folded into a tight square, tucked beneath a pencil case, pressed flat and deliberate as if someone had wanted it to stay hidden but not so hidden that it would never be found. Carlyle did not move for 3 seconds. 3 seconds is a long time when you are trained to notice things. He registered the paper's edges, the way it had been folded with intention, the way it sat differently from everything else in the pocket, everything else belonging and this one thing very clearly not belonging. He registered all of this before he touched it, before he reached for the latex glove that was standard procedure, before he did anything except stand very still and breathe and look at the folded square of white paper tucked beneath a Batman pencil case in the school bag of a future king. He called it in before he even opened it. That was the protocol. Object of interest, location, time. 3 facts. Calm voice. The communication was brief and precise, the kind of language that carries maximum information in minimum syllables, because people who do this job long enough learn that panic is a luxury you cannot afford and brevity is a form of professionalism. Within 90 seconds, 2 more officers appeared at the door of the room. Within 3 minutes, the bag was treated as a potential evidence item. Within 5 minutes, the morning had changed. The note, when carefully unfolded with gloved hands, was handwritten in black ink. The handwriting was neat. That was the first thing anyone noticed, and it was the thing that made the back of Carlyle's neck go cold. Not the frantic scrawl of someone unhinged. Not the block capitals of anonymous malice. Neat. Deliberate. The handwriting of someone who had taken their time. The message was short. 11 words and a symbol. The words themselves are not publicly known, and they will not be here either, but the people who read them in that room described the experience afterward, in the careful language of official testimony and private conversation, as the experience of the floor dropping slightly beneath their feet. Not a threat that announced itself with bluster. A threat that was specific. That demonstrated knowledge. That told, without telling directly, that whoever had written it had been close enough, recently enough, to know things they should not have known. Things about George's schedule. Things about his route. Things that had not been published anywhere. Things that lived only inside the walls of careful, protected plans. The room where the note was opened was not large. 3 officers. A supervisor called in from the floor below. The particular quality of silence that falls when professionals are processing something that exceeds what they were expecting to process on a Tuesday morning. Outside the window, a blackbird was doing something energetic in the garden hedge, indifferent to all of it. Kensington Palace has its own internal security structure, but it operates in layered coordination with broader Royal Protection Command, with MI5 liaison channels, with protocols that exist precisely for moments like this one, moments that are supposed to be hypothetical and, then, one Tuesday are not. The activation of those channels is not loud. It does not announce itself. From the outside, nothing changed. The garden still sat in its gray morning light. The staff still moved through their routines. The blackbird continued its hedge business without interruption. But, inside, something had cracked open. The first call reached Prince William's security detail at 8:47 a.m. The briefing was conducted in the particular tone that Royal Protection officers use when the news is serious, but the priority is containment of alarm. William was told what had been found. He was told what was being done. He was told that George was safe, that the morning school run was being reviewed, that decisions were being made above his pay grade and also very much within his right to be informed about because this was his son. He asked 3 questions. The answers to 2 of them are not recorded. The answer to the third was, "We don't know yet." The school run that morning was cancelled. This was communicated to the school through established channels with a cover explanation bland enough to be unremarkable. Children get sick. Schedules change. The machinery of royal life produces plausible explanations with the ease of a factory producing identical parts. Nobody at the school asked twice. George was not told immediately why his morning had changed. He was redirected with the particular diplomatic skill that the people around him had developed over years, offered an alternative, a change of plan presented as a preference rather than a response to crisis. He accepted it with the equanimity of a child who had learned early that his days sometimes shifted without full explanation. He went back to his room. He read. He was, by all accounts, entirely fine, because he did not yet know that his bag had become an evidence item, that his morning routine was being reconstructed minute by people in a room he had never been in, that the question of how a note had reached the inside pocket of his school bag without anyone knowing was the question that was making serious. Experienced professionals feel the particular cold that comes from a gap in what should be a gapless thing. The gap. That was what mattered now. Not just the note, but the how of the note. Security threats arrive with their own geography. They happen at the edges, at the perimeters, at the places where protection is thinnest. A note inside a pocket meant the perimeter had not held. It meant that somewhere, in the careful layered architecture of protection around this child, there was a space that someone had used. A moment. An access. A failure of the system to be what it was built to be. The bag had been with George since the previous afternoon. It had been in his room, in the car, briefly in a corridor, back in his room. It had been unattended for 3 distinct windows of time, each of them short, each of them within what should have been secure space. The reconstruction of those 3 windows began immediately and ran simultaneously with the forensic processing of the note and the review of all access logs for the past 24 hours. David Carlyle sat in a side room and gave his account 3 times, each time to a different person, each time with the precise and detailed memory of a man who had trained himself to observe and retain. He described the position of the note. He described how it sat in relation to the other items. He described the 3 seconds he had stood still before reaching for his glove. He described the temperature of the room and the sound of the blackbird and the fact that his hands had been completely steady throughout. They were still steady now. Outside the palace walls, London carried on its Tuesday with complete ignorance of any of this. Buses ran. Offices filled. People argued on the tube about whether it was too warm to wear a coat. A man in Knightsbridge was having a very loud conversation on his phone about a meeting he was late for. The ordinary world moved in its ordinary way, sealed off from the very specific, very serious quiet that had descended on a particular set of rooms in a particular palace in the middle of the city. In those rooms, the question that kept returning, the question that sat at the center of everything like a stone in still water, was not yet who. It was not yet why. Those would come. Those had their own processes, their own channels, their own people whose entire professional existence was built around answering exactly those questions. The question in that room, at that moment, was simpler and more unsettling than either of them. How close had they been? The investigation did not look like an investigation. That was, in many ways, the point. When the Royal Protection Command activates a serious threat protocol, the visible world is required to remain unchanged. Flags still fly. Ground staff still push their mowers in neat parallel lines across the grass. The faces of the people who walk the corridors of Kensington Palace remain professionally calm, because the alternative, visible alarm spreading through a royal household, is itself a kind of intelligence gift to whoever caused the alarm in the first place. You do not let them see what they have done to you. You do not let them measure the damage. So the palace looked the same. And, inside it, in rooms with closed doors, everything was being taken apart. The forensic team that processed the note worked with the careful deliberateness of people who understood that physical evidence at this level would be examined not just by their own chain of command but, potentially by a court, by a public inquiry, by history. Every step was documented. The paper was photographed before it was touched only with instruments, placed into an evidence bag with the same attention to procedure that a surgeon brings to a living body. The ink was typed. The paper stock was assessed. The fold lines were studied for what they might reveal about the hands that had made them. Handwriting analysis, as any forensic expert will tell you, is a science with limits. It can narrow. It can suggest. It can, in the right circumstances, exclude. What it found here was this: the writer was right-handed, almost certainly adult, with a level of education evident in the construction of the sentences, and the particular quality of the pen pressure suggested someone accustomed to writing by hand rather than someone who had picked up a pen specifically for this purpose. This was not the handwriting of a moment. It was the handwriting of a habit. That detail went into the report and stayed there, sitting quietly alongside everything else that was being built toward a picture of a person. Meanwhile, the Axis reconstruction was its own parallel world of problem-solving. The school bag's movements over the preceding 28 hours were charted with the precision of a naval navigation exercise. Every location. Every person who had been in proximity. Every window of time during which the bag had been unattended, and, in each of those windows, every person who had theoretically had access to the space the bag was in. The list of names produced by this process was not long. That was both reassuring and deeply uncomfortable. Reassuring because it meant the perimeter was narrower than worst-case scenarios. Uncomfortable because every name on the list was a known person. Someone who had been vetted. Someone who had been trusted. Someone who had been allowed inside the careful invisible walls that kept this family safe. The word nobody wanted to use yet was insider. It circled the room without being spoken. It sat behind the eyes of everyone doing the reconstruction work, because they all understood the arithmetic. A note inside a secured bag, placed there without detection, during a time period when only a limited number of people had access, pointed in a direction that was very uncomfortable to point. You could theorize external access. You could theorize a gap in the physical perimeter that had allowed someone unauthorized to reach the bag. These theories were explored, seriously, professionally, with the rigor applied to all theories. But, the access logs were clean. The entry points showed no anomaly.
The CCTV coverage, reviewed frame by frame, showed nothing. Which meant the absence of evidence was itself a form of evidence. 2 members of the household staff were quietly separated from their normal duties that afternoon. This was done without drama and, with the kind of administrative cover explanation that the palace machinery generates on demand. Shifts reassigned. Schedules adjusted. Nothing that would mark them as subjects of interest to anyone watching. Both were told nothing, which is its own particular experience, to be pulled sideways from your routine without being told why, to carry on as normally as you can while understanding that something has changed and not knowing what. One of them, a woman who had worked at the palace for 9 years, reportedly asked a colleague if they knew anything. The colleague said no. Neither of them slept particularly well that night. The royal family's senior security advisor, a man whose name is not a matter of public record and who appears in no photographs and gives no interviews, convened a briefing at 2 in the afternoon. Present were the heads of the relevant protection units, a liaison from the Metropolitan Police's Counter-Terrorism Command, and a representative from the security service whose presence at such briefings is routine and also never discussed publicly. The briefing was conducted in the language of that world, precise, jargon-rich, emotionally evacuated. Threat matrix. Risk elevation. Asset protection reconfiguration. The language creates a useful distance from the human reality of what is being discussed, which is that a child has been targeted and the people responsible for keeping that child safe are sitting in a room trying to understand how it happened. The question of motive was raised early and treated with appropriate caution. Threat actors in this category span a wide range of psychological and ideological profiles. There are people who send threatening communications to the royal family driven by mental illness. There are people driven by political conviction. There are people driven by grievance, personal or ideological. And there are, more rarely but more dangerously, people driven by something organized, something with resources and planning and the kind of patience that turns up in notes that are specific rather than general, that demonstrate knowledge rather than fantasy. The specificity of this note's content, the things it knew about George's schedule and route, pushed the probability weighting away from the first category and toward something more considered. That recalibration changed the urgency of everything. By 4 in the afternoon, Prince George's security profile had been quietly upgraded. This is not something announced. It is not something that appears on a memo that anyone outside a very small circle sees. It manifests as a slightly different configuration of bodies around a child, slightly different routes, slightly different timing patterns that break the predictability that threat actors rely on. George would have noticed some of this, perhaps, in the way children notice when the adults around them are behaving slightly differently without being able to articulate exactly what has changed. He is a perceptive boy. But nobody told him anything yet, because the decision about what to tell him and when involved considerations that extended well beyond what he might want to know and into the realm of what would be operationally wise. His parents were a different matter. The briefing with William and Catherine happened that evening. The couple have, over the years of their public life, developed a relationship with security protocol that is different from the relationship their predecessors had. They engage. They ask questions. They push back when they think something has been handled wrongly or communicated poorly. This meeting was not comfortable. William, by all accounts, was focused and controlled in the way that people who have processed a great deal of grief learn to be focused and controlled, which is to say the control was visible and the thing it was controlling was also visible if you knew where to look. Catherine asked questions about the specific gaps in the procedure that had allowed the note to be placed. She asked about the 2 staff members who had been separated from their duties. She asked what would be told to George and when and by whom. These were the right questions. They were answered as fully as they could be answered, given that answers were still being constructed in other rooms. The hardest question of the evening was the one that came near the end, from William, who asked it quietly and without drama. He asked whether the threat was assessed as current or as a precursor. Whether they were looking at something that had already happened, a statement made and filed, or at something that was still in motion. The answer was that they did not yet know. The investigation was hours old. The analysis was ongoing.
The honest position was uncertainty, and the honest communication of that uncertainty to a parent sitting across a table asking about the safety of his child was one of the more difficult professional obligations in the room that night.
He nodded. He thanked the people in the room.
He and Catherine walked out together, and the door closed behind them, and whatever passed between them and the corridor outside was private. The palace settled into its night routines. Lights dimmed in some wings and remained on in others. The security shift changed with its usual precision. George slept, as far as anyone could tell from the monitors, soundly, the uncomplicated sleep of a boy who did not yet know the full weight of what the day had carried. But, in the investigation rooms, the lights stayed on.
The access logs were reviewed again.
The handwriting analysis was supplemented with linguistic analysis of the note's phrasing. The CCTV footage was enhanced and re-examined. New questions were being asked of the physical evidence, specific questions about the type of pen, the age of the paper, things that might seem minor and turned out never to be minor in this kind of work. And, somewhere, in the broader network of intelligence that exists precisely to catch things before they become catastrophes, the note's content had been cross-referenced with existing watch lists, existing cases, existing patterns of behavior that had been observed and catalogued and never quite led anywhere until now, or perhaps still not now. Perhaps this was still a thread that went nowhere, but the cross-referencing had to happen, because threads that go nowhere still have to be followed to the place where they stop. The two staff members who had been quietly separated from their duties were interviewed the following morning, separately, in rooms that were professionally neutral and deliberately non-threatening. Both interviews were conducted by people trained in exactly this kind of conversation, the kind where you are trying to find out if someone is hiding something without making them defensive enough to hide it better.
Both interviews produced information.
Whether that information moved the investigation forward in meaningful ways is the kind of detail that lives in files that are not public and may never be public. What is known is that by the end of the second day, the investigation had a direction.
Not an answer. Not a name.
But a direction, a narrowing of the field of possibilities toward a smaller set of possibilities that could be more intensively examined. That is, in this kind of work, called progress. It does not feel like progress from the inside, particularly not when you are one of the people inside it. It feels like a slightly smaller version of not knowing. The public, in the meantime, knew nothing at all.
The school had been given its unremarkable explanation.
The press had no whisper of any of it. The palace's external face remained entirely unchanged, which is the thing that makes this world so strange to contemplate from the outside. The complete visibility of these people's lives, every appearance, every engagement, every photograph, every public word, existing simultaneously with the complete invisibility of the moments that actually matter.
The moments when something goes wrong.
The moments when the protection fails to hold and the thing it is supposed to prevent comes close enough to leave a note. Close enough to know things it should not have known. Close enough to reach inside a child's school bag and leave 11 words and a symbol that made the floor drop slightly beneath the feet of people who were very hard to frighten. The investigation moved into its third day with quiet, relentless momentum. Somewhere, a person who had written in neat black ink on a folded square of paper was going about their life without knowing what had been set in motion. Or perhaps they did know. Perhaps the knowing was the point. That possibility sat in every room where the investigation lived, unspoken and central, the way the most important things in any room are often the ones nobody has found the word for yet. By the fourth morning, the investigation had a suspect. Not a name written on a board with red string attached to photographs, the way these things are dramatized in television programs.
A direction of focus. A narrowing.
A set of digital and physical evidence threads that, when laid alongside each other, pointed more insistently toward one corner of the possible field than toward any other corner. This is how real investigations develop, not with the clean revelation of fiction, but with the slow accumulation of small consistencies that begin to form the outline of something.
The thread that moved things was not the handwriting analysis, though that contributed.
It was not the CCTV footage, which had been reviewed so many times by this point that the analysts could have described every frame from memory. It was something smaller and more procedural. The type of paper the note had been written on was distinctive in a specific way, not rare, not impossible to obtain, but particular enough that it narrowed the field. It was the kind of paper that comes in a specific brand of personal organizer, the kind that is sold in a small number of places and is not commonly found loose. The kind that someone would only have if they used that specific product. Access to the household records, the kind of administrative detail that is maintained for a large domestic operation, showed that a personal organizer of exactly that brand had been purchased as part of an office supply order 16 months earlier and delivered to a specific building within the palace complex. Signed for by a specific name. The name was connected to a roll. The roll had access. The access was consistent with the windows of time during which the bag had been unattended. The pieces did not prove anything. They pointed. Pointing and proving are different things, and the people running this investigation were professionally careful about the distinction, because acting on a point rather than a proof against someone inside a royal household is an action with consequences that cannot be undone. You do not accuse a person in this position without certainty. The cost of being wrong is too high in every direction. So the decision was made to investigate more, not less. To gather rather than act. To give the evidence threads more room to develop before anything was done that closed possibilities prematurely. The person the threads pointed toward was a man named Thomas Fenn. He had worked in a logistics and household coordination capacity for just under 2 years. He had come through the standard vetting process, which is thorough, though like all human systems it is not perfectly thorough, and the question of what vetting can and cannot catch is one of the things that would later be examined in painful detail. He was 34 years old. He had no criminal record. He had references that had been verified. He had, by all external measures, been unremarkable in the way that is professionally desirable in this environment. He was also, as digital forensics began to establish over the following 18 hours, a person with an online life that had not been fully visible during the original vetting. Not because he had hidden it expertly. Because the specific platforms and forums where he was active were not the ones that the standard vetting process prioritized. Dark corner of the mainstream internet rather than the actual dark web, the kind of spaces where extreme views migrate when they are pushed out of more visible platforms, where communities form around grievances and resentments and ideas that exist on the sliding scale between angry and dangerous. What he had written in those spaces, using a username that took digital forensics less time to link to his real identity than he presumably expected, was not illegal in its broadest form. Much of it was the familiar currency of online resentment, contempt for institutions, contempt for the class structures that those institutions represent, a view of the royal family that framed them as parasitic, as incompatible with a just society, as deserving of something that was never quite spelled out with the directness that would make it actionable on its own. He was careful, in the way that people who have read enough about legal thresholds become careful, never to say the one thing that would make a charge easy. But the tone. The specificity. The particular attention paid in some posts to Prince George, to the idea of continuation and legacy and the perpetuation of systems through children who hadn't chosen their position. The way some of the language, cross-referenced by linguistic analysts against the note, showed similarities of construction, rhythmic patterns of expression, specific phrasings that do not recur by coincidence. The file on Thomas Fenn was growing. It was being grown deliberately and carefully, the way you approach something that might startle if approached too quickly. During all of this, life inside the palace continued in its managed way. George attended school. The upgraded security arrangements around him were by this point so smoothly integrated into the texture of his days that he would have needed to be looking for them specifically to notice what had changed. He is, as those who work with him will quietly note, a boy who pays attention. But he is also 11, with an 11-year-old's priorities, and the particular security shuffle of adults around him registered as background noise against the more immediate concerns of a maths test on Thursday and a disagreement with a friend about something that mattered enormously in the way that only things at 11 can matter enormously. William and Catherine were updated at intervals. The updates were more substantive now, the shape of the investigation clearer, the direction of focus able to be communicated even if the word suspect was still not the word anyone was formally using. Catherine had, according to people present at one of these briefings, a quality of stillness in her face when receiving difficult information that is different from the stillness of someone who is not reacting. It is the stillness of someone who is processing very fast behind a surface that gives nothing away. She asked about timelines.
She asked about the reliability of the digital evidence. She asked whether Thomas Fenn had been under any form of observation since the investigation began, and, if so, whether that observation was clean, meaning whether he had detected it. She was told that it appeared clean. She received this with the nod of someone who understands the word appeared and everything it does and does not guarantee. On the fifth day, an additional piece of information arrived through an intelligence channel rather than through the forensic investigation itself. A liaison contact, the kind of professional relationship that exists between security services in ways that don't appear in any organizational chart anyone has seen, flagged that Thomas Fenn's name had appeared, briefly and, in a peripheral capacity, in a separate ongoing inquiry. Not as a subject. Not as a person of interest. As a name that had been mentioned in a conversation that had been recorded for other reasons entirely, mentioned casually and, without obvious significance, the kind of mention that only becomes significant in retrospect when the name comes up again in a different context. The peripheral mention, cross-referenced with everything the forensic investigation had already built, upgraded the assessment. This was no longer pointing toward a loner with a grievance who had acted impulsively. The peripheral connection, however thin, however preliminary, raised the question of whether Thomas Fenn was operating alone or whether the note was connected to something larger, something organized, something with reach enough to have placed him inside the palace complex. That question was the one that elevated the investigation to a different level of seriousness, the level at which the most senior people in the relevant agencies are briefed rather than simply informed. The decision was made, at that elevated level, to bring Thomas Fenn in for questioning. The timing and manner of this were deliberate, not at the palace, not in a way that would be visible to other staff or create alarm within the household, not in a way that would signal to whoever might be watching, if there was anyone watching, that the investigation had reached this point. He was contacted through administrative channels, given a reason for the meeting that was procedural and unremarkable, and asked to attend a location that was, to anyone observing from the outside, simply an office. He agreed without hesitation. This was noted. Agreement without hesitation could mean innocence. It could mean confidence in the cover story that had been built. It could mean that the person had not yet understood what the meeting was really about. The people analyzing his response were careful not to read too much into a single data point. He arrived wearing a navy jacket and carrying the same brand of personal organizer that the forensic paper analysis had flagged. He set it on the table when he sat down. He did not appear to notice the quality of attention that the people in the room immediately paid to that object. The interview began. The first 40 minutes covered routine territory, his role, his schedule over the relevant period, his access to various areas of the palace complex, his knowledge of Prince George's routines. He answered fluently and, specifically and, without the kind of over-elaboration that can indicate preparation. His account was consistent with the access logs. It placed him in proximity to the bag during one of the 3 windows of time that had been identified. He did not volunteer this information. When it was raised, gently and obliquely, his response was calm. Too calm, or the right amount of calm. These are the moments in this kind of work where the professional skills of the interviewer are tested most severely, the ability to read a person's calm as data without deciding too early what the data means. The shift came in the second hour, when the questioning moved toward his online activity. Not directly. Through a series of questions about his wider views, his political opinions, his relationship with his work. The questions were designed to open space rather than close it. To see what filled the space. What filled it was a pause of approximately 4 seconds. In a regular conversation, 4 seconds is nothing. In an interview room, with the context of everything that had been built to bring this moment into existence, 4 seconds is an event. He recovered. He answered. His answer was careful and somewhat general, the answer of someone choosing words rather than retrieving them. The interviewers moved on. He breathed. At the end of the second hour, he was informed that the interview was paused rather than concluded, that he was not free to leave the location, and that a legal representative was being made available to him. The specific language used at this moment is precise in the way that legal language must be precise, and it was delivered precisely, because the people in that room understood that this moment, this exact moment, was the beginning of something that would be examined very carefully afterward by many people. He sat with the information for a moment.
His personal organizer was still on the table, closed, the brand visible. His face did something that the interviewer would later describe, in official notes, as a brief and involuntary recognition. A small adjustment of the muscles around the eyes and mouth, lasting less than 2 seconds, that registered before the professional calm re-established itself.
Less than 2 seconds. The kind of thing that would never hold up in court on its own. The kind of thing that the interviewer wrote down anyway, because in this work you record everything and let other people decide what matters. The door opened. A legal representative entered. Thomas Fenn looked at the personal organizer on the table, then, away from it, in a sequence that lasted less than a second. The interviewer wrote that down too. Outside, London continued its ignorance of all of this.
The palace's public face remained unchanged.
The flags flew.
The ground staff moved across the grass.
And, in a room that looked like an office, a man in a navy jacket sat across a table from people who had spent 5 days reconstructing the path that had led here, and the air between them held everything that had not yet been said. Thomas Fenn did not confess on the first day. Or the second. This was not surprising to the investigators.
People who operate with enough premeditation to place a note inside a secured bag without detection, who write in neat and deliberate hand rather than frantic impulse, who maintain a professional exterior inside a royal household for nearly 2 years, do not unravel quickly.
They have practiced the distance between what they know and what they show.
They have lived inside that distance long enough to be comfortable there.
What Fenn did, across the first 2 days of formal questioning, was cooperate.
This is the word his legal representative used in every public-facing communication thereafter.
He cooperated with the inquiry. He answered questions. He denied placing the note. He denied authoring the note.
He said he recognized the type of paper when it was shown to him, because yes, he used that brand of organizer, but that was not unusual. That brand was sold in many places. That connection proved nothing about authorship.
He said this calmly.
He said it correctly. He was, his legal representative emphasized, cooperating. But the digital forensics team was not interested in his cooperation. They were interested in his devices. The phone and laptop that were secured when he was taken into custody contained, like all personal devices, the archaeological record of a life. Most of what is on anyone's phone is meaningless, background noise, accumulation, the digital equivalent of the receipts and old bus tickets that accumulate at the bottom of a coat pocket. But forensic digital analysis is the science of finding the things that are not meaningless inside the noise, and the team applied to Fenn's devices was experienced and thorough in ways that left very little room. What they found on the phone was a deleted conversation. Deleted, but recoverable, because deletion on a consumer device is almost never the permanent erasure that most people imagine. The conversation had been conducted through an encrypted messaging application, the kind marketed for privacy and used by everyone from investigative journalists to people with things to hide. The encryption itself was not breached. The content of the messages within the application was not readable. But the metadata was readable, meaning the fact of the conversations, their timestamps, their frequency, the account identifiers of the people on the other end. Not what was said, but the shape of a relationship conducted in a medium chosen for its absence of records. The account on the other end of the conversation was traced. The trace led to a VPN, and, through the VPN to a server location, and, from there into a chain of technical obfuscation that was, by the standards of this kind of investigation, not amateur. The infrastructure of the obfuscation was the infrastructure of someone who had received help setting it up, or who had been operating at this level long enough to understand how to do it properly. This finding was the one that made the investigators certain, or as certain as investigators allow themselves to be before the word certain has legal standing, that Thomas Fenn was not operating alone. The question of who was on the other end of those conversations was now the central question, pushing everything else sideways. The note, the breach of the perimeter, the specific knowledge the note had demonstrated about George's schedule, all of it now sat inside a larger frame that was still being built, still being understood. Fenn was a component. What he was a component of was the thing that kept the most senior people in the relevant agencies awake at night in ways that they would not formally describe and will not formally describe until or unless these events become part of the public record. On the 8th day of the investigation, Fenn's legal representative communicated that his client wished to make a statement.
Not a confession. A statement.
The legal architecture around that distinction matters enormously, and everyone in the room when the statement was made understood the architecture. What Fenn said, in the careful language of a prepared statement delivered in the presence of lawyers and recorded in full, was this: he had been approached. Approximately 14 months earlier, through a connection made initially online and, then, moved to the encrypted application, he had been approached by someone who presented a set of ideas that he found himself in agreement with, ideas about the nature of inherited power, about the legitimacy of institutions that perpetuate themselves through bloodline and ceremony rather than merit or democratic choice. He was not, he said, a violent person.
He had not been asked to do anything violent.
He had been asked, over a period of months, to do a series of small things, each of them individually defensible, each of them alone barely meaningful.
Observe certain routines. Note certain patterns. Share certain information. Small things.
The kind of things that someone embedded in a household could do without drama and without detection.
And, then, eventually, the note.
Not composed by him, he said.
Given to him. Placed by him.
The first time he had been asked to do something that crossed the line he had privately maintained, and he had crossed it. He did not explain, in the statement, why he had crossed it rather than stopped. The legal representative noted that his client was willing to cooperate with the inquiry into the wider network he had been part of, in exchange for considerations that were appropriate to the level of cooperation offered. The investigators listened to this statement with the particular attention of people who are simultaneously recording what they are hearing and evaluating its reliability, its completeness, its strategic purpose from the speaker's point of view. A person making a statement of this kind has motivations. The motivations shape the statement.
The shape of the statement is itself data.
What the statement confirmed, most usefully, was the existence of the network. The thing that had been inferred from the metadata was now explicitly named. Someone, somewhere, had identified Fenn's ideological sympathies, cultivated a relationship, placed him in a position to provide intelligence about the interior of a royal protection environment, and eventually used him to deliver a message that was designed to demonstrate capability.
The note was not a threat in the sense of a demand with a deadline. It was a demonstration. A proof of concept. We are this close. We were here. We can do this.
Demonstrations of this kind have a purpose. They establish credibility. They function as evidence presented to others, to funders, to allies, to people who need to be persuaded that an operation has the reach it claims to have. They are a recruitment tool and a statement of ambition simultaneously. The implications of this analysis rippled outward from the investigation like rings on water.
If the note was a demonstration, then, there were people it was being demonstrated to.
If there were people it was being demonstrated to, then, the note was not the end of something. It was the beginning of something, or a stage in the middle of something that had been in motion for longer than 14 months, longer perhaps than anyone yet understood.
Counterterrorism intelligence does not move quickly.
It moves carefully and slowly, because the cost of moving quickly and getting it wrong is the loss of the thread, the scattering of a network, the disappearance of the people you were trying to reach into channels that are harder to follow. So the information Fenn provided was processed with patience. The account identifiers from the encrypted messaging application were worked through the broader intelligence infrastructure. Names and connections were built slowly. The person or persons at the other end of those conversations were not, as far as anyone could determine, in the United Kingdom. They were operating from a location that required international intelligence cooperation to pursue, the kind of cooperation that has its own pace and its own politics and cannot be rushed by the urgency of one investigation, however serious. William and Catherine were briefed on what Fenn's statement had revealed. This briefing was more complete than any of the previous ones, because the picture was now more complete, and the people doing the briefing had concluded that the parents of the child at the center of this situation deserved to understand the full shape of what had happened rather than a sanitized version of it. Catherine asked, at the end of the briefing, a question that nobody in the room found surprising. She asked what had been done to ensure that the failure in the vetting process that had allowed Fenn to be placed in this position would be addressed, and not just addressed in this specific case, but addressed at the level of the process itself, the methodology, the gaps. She was told that this review had already begun. She received this with the same quality of stillness as before, the stillness that processes rather than accepts. She said she would like to receive the findings of that review directly, not through a summary, but directly. This was agreed to. George was told a version of what had happened, appropriately shaped for an 11-year-old in his position, which is to say truthful in its essentials and careful about details that would serve no purpose in being shared and might serve a purpose in being withheld. He was told that a person who worked at the palace had done something that was wrong and had been removed. He was told that the people responsible for keeping him safe were doing their jobs well and that he was safe. He was told, by his father, in a private conversation that lasted about 20 minutes and of which no official record exists, whatever else a father tells his son in a moment like that one. He asked one question, apparently, that his father was not immediately sure how to answer. He asked whether the person who had done the wrong thing had done it because of who he was, meaning George himself, his specific self, or because of what he was, meaning the title, the lineage, the position. Whether it was him personally that the note had targeted, or the idea of him. His father took a moment. He told him, as honestly as he could, that he thought it was the idea. That it was the position, the symbol, the institution, not the boy who liked football and chocolate biscuits and kept a small red London bus eraser in his pencil case because he'd had it since he was 6. That the people who had sent the message were not thinking about him as a person. They were thinking about what he represented. George was quiet for a moment after that. Then, he said something that his father apparently repeated to the security briefing team afterward, not because it was operationally relevant, but because he felt it should be noted. George said that he thought that was almost sadder than if it had been personal. That people could look at another person and not see the person at all. He was 11 years old. He went back to his room. He finished his homework. He asked, that evening, whether he could have a biscuit before bed, and was told he could not because it was too close to bedtime, and he argued about this with the quiet persistence of someone who was not going to win but was going to register his dissatisfaction on the record. Outside, London did what London does. Cars and rain and the permanent low hum of 8 million lives being lived in proximity. The palace sat inside the city the way it always had, old stone and new security, continuity and the endless invisible effort of keeping continuity alive. Thomas Fenn was charged with offences under the relevant statutes. The charges were not made public immediately. These things move through legal processes that operate at the pace of legal processes. His cooperation with the investigation into the broader network he had described was ongoing. The people on the other end of the encrypted conversations were still being sought. The review of the vetting process was underway. George went to school on Thursday and, as far as anyone can tell, worried primarily about the maths test. The story did not end with a trial. That is not how these things end, not cleanly, not quickly, not in ways that give the people closest to them the satisfaction of a closed chapter. What happened instead was what always happens with matters of this kind. The visible portion of the events eventually became visible, and the much larger invisible portion remained invisible, filed into the kind of records that are classified for decades, examined by oversight committees in sessions that are never reported publicly, understood in full by a very small number of people who sign documents committing them to silence about what they understand. The visible portion emerged approximately 3 months after the morning David Carlyle had unzipped the front pocket of a school bag and found a folded square of white paper where only a pencil case should have been. It emerged not through any official announcement but through the process by which these things tend to become known, a journalist with a source with knowledge, a single published line that confirmed something had happened without confirming what it had been. The line was carefully worded. It did not name George. It referred to a security review at the palace level, prompted by an incident that had been resolved. Resolved was the word used. It is a word that does a great deal of work. The British press, operating under the particular conventions of royal reporting, did not immediately push beyond that line. There are layers of pressure and protocol around what gets published about the royal family, particularly about the children, layers that involve legal frameworks and editorial conventions and the long-standing tradition of restraint that journalists in this beat observe with varying degrees of willingness. The detail of the note, the name of Thomas Fenn, the shape of the investigation that had followed, remained unprinted for weeks beyond that first line. When more did emerge, it emerged in fragments, the way serious stories about security matters always do, each fragment adding a piece without completing the picture, each piece picked up and examined by people who understood some of the context and speculated about the rest. The public conversation that followed was, like all public conversations about events of this kind, a mixture of genuine analysis, informed speculation, and the particular quality of anxiety that attaches to threats against children. People understand, viscerally and immediately, the wrongness of a child being targeted, and the fact that this child was not just any child, that he carried the specific weight of inheritance and public role, made the wrongness feel both more outrageous and somehow more inevitable in the way that the worst things feel inevitable in retrospect. The formal response from the palace was measured and minimal. A spokesperson confirmed that a security matter had been reviewed and that procedures had been strengthened in light of findings. This is the language of institutional response, language that communicates without revealing, that satisfies the requirement to say something without providing the raw material for further questions. It was, in the estimation of most observers, about as much as was going to be said officially. But the unofficial reverberations were larger and lasted longer. Within the security and intelligence community, the incident became a reference case. Not a public one. A private one, discussed in briefings and internal reviews and the conversations between professionals that shape how protection is done without those conversations ever becoming anything that a member of the public would encounter. The specific failure that Fenn had represented, the gap between standard vetting and the reality of a person's ideological commitments and online activity, was examined in detail. The examination was uncomfortable because it revealed something that everyone in the field already knew but had perhaps not confronted with sufficient urgency. The gap between who someone appears to be and who they are has been widening in proportion to the availability of online spaces where people construct and maintain separate identities. The vetting process that had been adequate for a previous generation of threats was not fully adequate for the current landscape. Changes were made. The specifics of those changes are not public and will not be public, because publicizing them would be to publicize the weaknesses they were designed to address, which would make the address less effective. This is the permanent paradox of security. The most important work is the work that cannot be discussed, and the most significant improvements are the ones that never appear in any announcement. The network that Fenn had described, the people at the other end of the encrypted conversations, the organization or loose affiliation or ideologically motivated group that had identified him, cultivated him, placed him, and used him, remained the subject of active investigation across multiple jurisdictions for a long time afterward. Some of what that investigation found became the basis for action in countries other than the United Kingdom, through the slow and complicated machinery of international law enforcement cooperation. Whether the people ultimately responsible for the note were ever held to full account is something that does not have a clean public answer, because the legal actions that followed were dispersed across jurisdictions and time periods and presented to the public without the connective tissue that would have made their relationship to this incident legible. This is also how these things work. The narrative that the public gets is never the whole narrative. It is a series of events that can be followed but not fully understood without the parts that are not released. The researchers and journalists who tried to assemble the complete picture found themselves, as they always do in such cases, able to see the outline of something without being able to fill it in. Thomas Fenn was ultimately convicted. The charges, when they were finally made public as part of the legal proceedings, were framed in language that was precise and serious and that conveyed the gravity of what he had done without conveying the full operational context, because the full operational context was itself classified. He was sentenced to a term of imprisonment that was, in the judgment of those who followed these matters, significant but not as significant as the underlying facts might have warranted if those facts had been fully presentable in a public courtroom. His cooperation with the broader investigation was noted by the court as a mitigating factor. He has not spoken publicly about any of it. His legal representative has issued no statements beyond what was required by the legal proceedings. In the months following the investigation,
the security arrangements around Prince George continued their evolution. Not announced, never announced.
The texture of protection around him changed in ways that he would have noticed and, almost certainly did notice, because he is a boy who pays attention. The particular quality of his life, the life of a child who is also a public institution, requires a kind of adaptation that most children are never asked to develop, the ability to inhabit both the ordinary and the extraordinary simultaneously without being crushed by either. By all accounts, he developed it. By all accounts, he continued to be, within the unusual parameters of his existence, recognizably and determinately himself. He kept the red London bus eraser. As far as anyone knows, he still has it. The morning that started this, the particular Tuesday that began like all the other Tuesdays and, then, changed, sits now in the memory of the people who lived it as a marker. David Carlyle, the protection officer who unzipped the bag and found the note, continued in his role for the following year before a transfer moved him to a different assignment. In the interview he gave to an internal review committee, the one conducted as part of the procedural review that followed the incident, he said that the thing he remembered most clearly was not the note itself, not its content, not even the 3 seconds he stood still before reaching for his glove. He remembered the blackbird in the garden hedge. He remembered the sound of it, indifferent and energetic, doing whatever blackbirds do in garden hedges on grey Tuesday mornings in London. He said that in the days afterward, when he was processing what had happened and what it meant, he found the memory of the blackbird strangely steadying. That the world contains both things simultaneously, the note in the bag and the bird in the hedge, the serious and the ordinary, the threatening and the utterly indifferent, and that the work of protection is the work of holding both those realities at the same time, of being the thing that stands between the note and the child. He had been that thing. He had done his job. The child was safe. That is, in the end, the only metric that matters in this work. Not the elegance of the investigation, not the speed of the resolution, not the completeness of the public understanding. Whether the child was safe. Whether the thing that was supposed to hold held. It held. The garden at Kensington Palace is maintained by groundskeepers who arrive before anyone else is awake and work with the particular care of people who understand that they are responsible for something that needs to be permanently presentable. In spring, when the hedges are freshly trimmed and the flowers are making their first appearance in the beds that line the paths, the garden looks the way royal gardens are supposed to look, permanent, ordered, indifferent to time. The kind of thing that suggests continuity so successfully that you stop wondering about the enormous invisible effort of maintaining it. Which is, of course, exactly the point. The investigation that began on that Tuesday with a folded square of white paper in a front pocket is part of that invisible effort now. Filed. Processed. Learned from. The people who ran it have moved on to other matters that are also invisible. The network that sent the note is being watched, in the patient and unannounced way that serious watching is done, in rooms that have no windows and are not on any map that the public has access to. George is older now than he was. He is in the phase of his life where the years pass with the particular speed of early adolescence, each year adding complexity to the person he is becoming, each year bringing him incrementally closer to the role that waits for him at the end of this period of preparation. The people who protect him have adapted to every new phase. They will continue to adapt. The note is filed somewhere. Processed, analyzed, cross-referenced, catalogued into a system where it sits alongside every other piece of evidence from an investigation that the public will never fully understand and that the people directly involved will carry in various ways for the rest of their lives. 11 words and a symbol. The words are not public and may never be. But the response to them, the 5 days and all the days after, the people who stayed in rooms with the lights on all night, the questions asked in the careful language of professionals who cannot afford to panic, the parent who sat across a table from his security team and asked the question no official report records the answer to, the boy who went back to his room and read and slept and argued about biscuits, all of it was real, and all of it mattered. The palace stands. The flags fly. The garden is maintained. And, somewhere in London, on mornings that look like every other morning, the invisible machinery of keeping something very old alive continues its work, quiet and relentless and entirely unseen. As it always has. As it must.